welcome everyone. You have made it to our March Network Café, entitled Why Not Both? Providing Housing and Protecting Land Across New Hampshire. This Network Café is part of our 2024-2025 Network Café Series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Colleen Jennings. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the New Hampshire Food Alliance. And we're going to start things off as we usually do with some introductions. I've invited everybody before and now to introduce yourselves in the chat. Like Nicole said, it helps us kind of get an idea of who's here, who's in the room, helps our speakers kind of think about who they're talking to while they're sharing all their great information. So please do that. And while you're doing that, you can also check out our agenda, which will be in the chat, as well as on that agenda is our working agreement for our network cafes, which will, if you take a look at that, we'll share a little bit about what you can expect from us during this time together and what we expect from you as we learn together today. So a little bit about us as an introduction before we get things started. I am one of a small team of people who work at the New Hampshire Food Alliance, and together we coordinate a network of over 200 organizations, businesses, communities that are dedicated to growing a thriving, fair, and sustainable local food system here in the Granite State. So all those organizations that you see there on that slide and many more, we build relationships with each other, we learn together, and we collaborate to advance our common goals and respond creatively to challenges and amplify our collective impact together. And we do all of this work and much more as a community outreach program of the Sustainability Institute at the University of New Hampshire in Durham. And as part of UNH, we share in the university's dedication to its core educational mission. And by doing that, we're embracing the many characteristics of our community members that make them uniquely themselves. So one piece of our work is hosting these Network Café series and these Network Cafés. We host them as really inclusive opportunities for all of us to come together and learn about things that are affecting our food system. So these hot topics and issues that are critical to address and that our food system is facing at this moment. We host them every Friday, the first Friday of each month, September through April. And we, as I said, these are places for us to learn together and really address issues that are top of mind for everybody kind of in our food system right now, which leads me to why we're here today. So we're going to tackle two tough issues today. We're going to talk about housing and we're going to talk about conservation, particularly with a focus on ag land preservation. And we're especially going to talk about where those two issues come together and where they intersect. The old story of housing and land conservation is that only one of them can prevail. And today we're really going to question that premise. And we're going to do that by first hearing from our presenters. They're going to kind of give us the story, the lay of the land, if you will, of the housing conservation work happening in New Hampshire and the issues that those sectors are facing. And then we're going to hear about the really exciting things and possibilities that happen and rise to the surface when those two sectors kind of intersect with each other inevitably. We're going to hear some of that from Sarah and Jamie. They're kind of going to dive into that intersection a little bit, but then we're going to spend some time together at the end, kind of having a discussion with all the super smart people in this room, a lot of people that I have leaned on to prepare this Network Cafe. And we're going to hopefully, I hope, share about the amazing organizations and resources and projects and tools and all the things that are helping to produce a collaborative environment for the housing folks and conservation folks to work better together. So that is our goal. I'm hoping it's not too big. I think it's going to be great. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to our first presenter, Sarah Wrightsman, who is the Community Engagement and Education Manager for New Hampshire Housing. She's going to kick things off for us. So take it away, Sarah. And I'm going to give you your control. Let's see.
Great, thanks, Colleen. We're experimenting with sharing control of our slides.
Let's see.
I did it. Okay. So Hey everyone, I'm really glad that you're here. I'm loving the sort of introductions in the chat. Seems like there's a good mix of like there are some clear housing people, there are some clear conservation people coming together for this conversation. So it's fantastic. So I'm going to kick off my part of the presentation with a little bit of data, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about strategies, but it's going to be kind of like high level, so we could spend easily 90 minutes on just this sort of topic of the housing market. If you want to get deeper in that, we absolutely can at some point. So I'm going to start with some of the big scary numbers. How much housing does New Hampshire need? This is a question we get asked a lot, and these numbers come from our statewide housing needs assessment, which we published in 2023. So I'm going to jump right to the big scary number. We need nearly 90,000 new units between 2020 and 2040. Obviously, we're already 5 years into that. So we sort of calculated that that means that we need to increase building permit activity by about 36%. And I like to start with that big number, but then sort of immediately make it less scary. So you can look, if you boil this 90,000 down to like individual communities, it gets a lot more sort of doable. And a lot of our regional planning commissions did exactly that when they did their regional housing needs assessment. All 9 of them did that also in 2023. They're different from one another, so I would encourage you to reach out to your RPC. There's several RPC folks that are on the call right now. I looked at my community specifically. So I live in Newmarket. We're part of Stratford Regional Planning Commission. I know there are folks from SRPC on the call right now. And in Newmarket, we need to build 961 units between 2020 and 2040. For Newmarket, that's actually a little bit daunting. It's a lot less scary than 90,000, right? But it's still a little bit daunting because we're so little and don't have a ton of buildable land left. Whereas on a town like Brookfield, also in SRPC's region, only needs to build 35 units between 2020 and 2040. So we're talking about totally different things depending on the community's sort of capacity and size and economy and needs, their sort of projected demand. So for the most part, when we break it down to the local level, it starts to feel a lot more doable and a lot sort of less scary. So, and I don't want to spend let's see if I can move my slide. Doable, but it's okay. I don't want to spend a ton of time on data, but I definitely wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how we got here and the sort of building permits to date. So this is what building permits look like between 1980 and 2023. Of course, looking at building permits isn't perfect because building permits don't always equal actual units that are built. It doesn't always equal like a certificate of occupancy. But this data comes from the Office of Planning and Development at New Hampshire BEA, and we have folks on the call from BEA here too. So you can see if you look at like these past several years, there's kind of like obviously 1980s, big boom in housing, early 2000s, another kind of nice, more sustainable boom in housing. And then 2008 and the housing crash happened. We're sort of in recession levels after that. And even now in, 2021, 2022, 2023, we really haven't gotten back to those sort of pre-recession levels of like pre-2008. So the crux of the issue, right, is that we're not building enough housing. I can move my own slide, but it's not very fast. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about housing inventory on the for sale side. On the for sale side, we measure inventory in months of supply. So it basically means if no new homes were listed and the market continued at the same pace, how quickly would we run out of the existing supply that we have? So we consider 6 months a balanced market. We're unfortunately very far from 6 months, and we have been for several years. We currently have about 2.3 months of supply. This means that things are harder for buyers than they are for sellers. When inventory is low, this is when we see cash buyers are winning out. Buyers are purchasing homes sight unseen sometimes. Folks are waiving inspections to be more competitive. That kind of thing is happening. So this is very, very hard for younger people. It's for lower income people and for first-time home buyers. It's disproportionately impacting those folks and other folks that are sort of at the lower end of the market. If anybody has tried to buy a home in the last several years, you've experienced that yourself. And so that being said, it's probably not surprising to hear that the median sales price is also high. So we've seen a 47% increase since July of 2020. median purchase price is over $500,000 now. I've been doing this housing related work for about 8 years. I distinctly remember at sort of the beginning of my career that it was like big news that the median purchase price for the state was up over $300,000, and now we're up over $500,000. Renters, of course, are not faring that much better. The median gross rent for 2-bedroom units is over $1,800. It's a 36% increase over the past 5 years. So that is a challenge. Of course, out of context, these numbers might be hard to wrap our heads around. Like I said, $1,800. Some people might be thinking like, wow, that's so much. I remember my apartment that was $600 a month. And some people might be thinking like $1,800, like that's easy peasy. That's nothing, right? So I wanted to compare it with some of the sort of high demand occupations and real wages that people are earning. So among the sort of high demand occupations that we selected, this was part of our residential rental cost survey that we published in 2024. Only registered nurses can afford more than the median gross rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in New Hampshire, and electricians and public school teachers were the only folks who could afford a 1-bedroom unit. Carpenters, firefighters, et cetera, according to their wages, cannot afford a 1-bedroom apartment. So this is assuming rental affordability. 30% of your gross monthly income is going towards your housing costs. And I rarely talk about sort of demographic data in my presentation, but I did want to include a note specifically on household size. I'm going to circle back to it later in this presentation when we talk about strategies. And it's because of the impact that this specifically has had on the housing market. So even if the population hadn't changed at all, we would still need more housing units today than we need in the past. And this is because the average persons per household has decreased. So in 1960, there's 3 persons per household. In 2022, there's an average of 2.5 persons per household. New Hampshire is just below that sort of median, that national average at 2.46 persons per household. And you can look at this data too, also in the number of single person households, and it shows sort of the same trend. So people are living alone at higher rates, families are having fewer children, and we know that the issue is then that we have sort of oversized housing in New Hampshire and have a demand for smaller housing types, smaller and more affordable. So the good news is that we know that zoning reform works. So there's some new research from Pew that basically demonstrates that rent growth is lower where housing has been added, and there's more housing where zoning reform has taken place. They did this sort of analysis of some Midwestern cities, which I know we're not in the Midwest, but this was a sort of great and very reaffirming study that they did. So the question for us then is, how do we create more housing while simultaneously preserving land for agriculture and recreation and protecting our sort of rural character in New Hampshire? Because we need growth. We know that growth is happening, but we want it to be appropriate for the sort of New Hampshire context. And before we talk about strategies, I did want to just sort of baseline talk about definitions so that when we get to the discussion later, everybody's kind of on the same page. So I already mentioned that affordable means that no more than 30% of your household income is spent on your gross housing costs. Gross housing costs just basically is inclusive. So if you are a homeowner, it's going to include your, your taxes and insurance. If you're a renter, it's going to include your utilities. So no more than 30% of your household income is spent on gross housing costs. That's kind of an older sort of established criteria for what affordability means. We can have a whole discussion too about whether or not 30% of your household income is still appropriate today, but that's how we're defining affordable. I wouldn't say I tend not to use the phrase affordable housing, but I acknowledge that affordable housing is pretty vague as a phrase. When you hear me say it, it's usually because I'm trying to be vague. I'm trying not to be too specific. Affordability is relative, right? So there's certainly people who are cost-burdened, meaning that they're spending more than 30% of their household income on their gross housing costs, but most people live in affordable housing, i.e., housing that is affordable to them, right? Like all housing is affordable to someone. And I hear people use the phrase affordable housing to mean very different things. So, whatever that might mean to you when you hear the phrase affordable housing. Workforce housing, on the other hand, has a very specific definition that's established in New Hampshire RSA 67458 to 61. So, we have a state law that establishes what workforce housing is. It's a rental housing that's affordable to people earning 60% of the area median income, or 100% for buyers, for sale housing that's affordable to people making 100% of the area median income. So a very sort of specific definition capturing either people who are making less than 60% AMI or 100% AMI. And there's a bunch of different ways that we build affordable housing and that affordable housing happens. Sometimes it's a developer subsidy like the low income housing tax credit project, where we're giving New Hampshire Housing gives financing to developers and they're building affordable housing that meets the sort of specific criteria of this financing. Sometimes it's people are holding Section 8 housing choice vouchers and they're going and using that and getting their housing subsidized. Sometimes it's stuff like deed restrictions. So say if the community says we need you to build 10% of the units in this development are affordable, we're giving you this extra sort of density bonus in exchange, there might be a deed restriction in place that requires that housing be affordable for a certain time period or in perpetuity. A lot of the housing in New Hampshire, or at least used to be, that is affordable is naturally occurring affordable housing. So it's housing that just kind of, for whatever reason, falls under those thresholds. And often you'll see that being like older housing stock, dilapidated housing stock, smaller units, that kind of thing. So that used to be a big part of what our affordable housing is, and because of the market is a lot less of what it is now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple specific strategies that communities can use where they're increasing their housing. You know, they recognize that we need housing growth. We need more housing in New Hampshire. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, I think all but one, are ways to use really already set development. So instead of,
Sarah,
building new, yeah,
sorry to interrupt you. You just once in a while are going in and out. Could you just say that last
okay.
sentence again? I feel like it was an important one.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I am working from home today and my home internet for whatever reason and Zoom are not best friends. So I was just saying that most of the strategies I'm going to talk about in this last little bit are pretty specific to like putting more housing where development already exists, putting more housing where increasing density where say we already have roads, we already have infrastructure, there's already sort of housing or commercial space in existence. So the first example is like adaptive reuse. So it's the practice of reusing old buildings for new purposes. So think the mills. New Hampshire is pretty famous for like our mills being used as housing now. Again, I live in Newmarket, downtown Newmarket, we have the mills. Other malls and other office buildings and commercial spaces, there's a lot of sort of potential there. And I've also seen like former schools being used as housing in the future. So I have a couple examples. There we go. So on the left is a former school building in Temple, New Hampshire. It now has 3 units of housing. Sorry, I think specifically not affordable housing. And then on the right is the Jaffrey Mill. So this is now affordable housing. This is in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and that was a low-income housing tax credit project done by a nonprofit developer. So sort of similarly, many of you have probably heard of accessory dwelling units. So ADUs are a secondary home or apartment that's on an existing single family lot. So it can be an apartment that's within the primary home, like a basement or an attic is common, attached to the primary home, or in an accessory building like above a garage or in a standalone cottage. It is noteworthy that in New Hampshire, we have a state law that requires communities allow attached ADUs wherever single family homes are allowed. The state statute's not perfect, so I'd still encourage communities to rework their local ordinances to make ADUs more accessible for homeowners. So that could be allowing detached ADUs, because not all communities do, reducing parking requirements, removing the owner occupancy requirement, and like increasing allowable size, things like that to make it easier. So this photo is an actual home with an accessory dwelling unit in Brookline, New Hampshire. So this is a great way in terms of our conservation goals. This is a great way to put housing where we already have housing instead of sort of eating up more land. Put housing where we already have housing, and it's gentle density, and it doesn't largely impact the sort of character or the fabric of the existing neighborhood. This one's a little bit different. So cluster housing or conservation subdivisions or open space ordinances, whatever your community calls them, they create opportunities for the creation of housing while preserving significant amount of lands for agriculture, recreation, conservation. So I looked at the Office of Planning and Development's municipal land use regulation survey just out of curiosity and found, I think, 179 municipalities and unincorporated places with zoning authority have a cluster housing or sort of open space type ordinance. So that's like over half the state is already using this tool to allow housing to be built without and conserving that land. I'm sure there'll be questions on that one. We can circle back to it at some point.
Can you maybe just do, sorry, Sarah, I'm gonna just ask you, that was a really, I think, a really valuable nugget for our food system community. Did you, I want to see if I heard it right. You said about 179 municipalities have zoning authority to, will you fill in the blank there for me?
So 179 of our municipalities have like a cluster housing ordinance or a conservation subdivision ordinance or an open space ordinance.
Okay.
So developers in those communities can build these sort of types of like cluster housing developments and conserve land while they're doing it.
So it's an ordinance. I was thinking there was something I wasn't familiar with, that it was zoning authority. Okay. And
No,
they have an ordinance. Got it.
It's an ordinance.
Thank you.
I'll also point out before I move on, I think my next slide is my very last one. I'll point out on this slide that all of these screenshots on my slides came from the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, and New Hampshire Housing Toolbox has a section for cluster housing. They have a section for accessory dwelling units. They have a section for adaptive reuse. They have a section for infill development, which I actually didn't include in my presentation, but is another one. And like, if you go to, I think it's New Hampshire Housing, nhhousingtoolbox.org. If you go to that, you can find sort of case studies, like explanations of what all of these things are if your community wants to sort of explore it more. So my last slide is on, there it is, residential conversions. And this is probably a favorite of mine because I have a deep appreciation for the sort of traditional and historic architecture that we have in New Hampshire. So for example, I didn't include any pictures of them, but like if you're familiar with the connected farm complex, so big house, little house, back house, barn, these like big structures, I drive down 85 in Newfields every single day, and I constantly see these connected farm complexes along the road. And so residential conversions are a great way to take these sort of oversized, and I promised I'd go back to my demographic slide about our oversized housing. They give us an opportunity to take this oversized housing and turn it into multiple units. So the town of Exeter, for example, allows conversions of single family homes into 2, 3, and 4 units. And it shows because Exeter's housing stock is very diverse. They have duplexes, they have triplexes, they have plenty of quads. So if we allow for the conversion of existing single family homes, it's homes that are there. So we're not really like creating new housing. We're not developing on new land. We're taking development that's already there. It makes it so we're sort of maintaining that like single family home sort of architecture and that sort of traditional New England architecture that we already have, but allows us to create more units. And there was also a change, I'll just note, because it's interesting, there was a recent change to the state building code that if you were taking an existing single family home or an existing duplex and you were turning it into 3 or 4 units, you no longer need to add a sprinkler system. So that is a significant cost savings to someone who wanted to sort of convert their single family home into 3 units or 4 units, whereas that was previously required. I will acknowledge that, of course, post 2020, most people need an extra bedroom for a home office, or a lot of people do anyway. Our housing stock is still probably oversized for family sizes in New Hampshire, and certainly out of a price range of a lot of people. So I'm gonna leave it there for now. I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. That was a ton of really good information. All right, I'm gonna move things over to Jamie, who is the Senior
Great.
New England Program Manager for American Farmland Trust. Take it away, Jamie.
Great. Let's see if I have the control power here.
You should.
Hold on. Okay. It works. Amazing. Okay. Great. And yeah, just caveat too, I am working from home as well today, and it's very windy out, so please just flag me if I cut in and out or anything like that. But yeah, thank you so much for having me, New Hampshire Food Alliance. As Colleen said, my name's Jamie Pottern. I'm the Senior New England Program Manager at American Farmland Trust, and I'm here to kind of provide some of the counterpoint to the housing side and some kind of background in trends and conversions and some of the threats to our farmland in New England and specifically in New Hampshire. So I'm going to run kind of quick through some of these data slides so we can really get to the discussion. But very briefly, for those of you who don't know American Farmland Trust, perhaps you've seen our No Farms, No Food bumper stickers. Some may not know what we do at AFT. But we're a national agricultural land trust. We work across the country to save the land that sustains us. We do that by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. We do that in lots of different ways through policy, advocacy, research, direct technical assistance to farmers, lots of work with communities all around the country. And we're really blessed to have a really robust regional team here in New England. We have boots on the ground in all 6 New England states. And again, one of the things that we really try to support communities on the ground with is empowering them with data about threats to farmland. So the statistics I'm going to cite today are primarily from our Farms Under Threat research study, which is sort of a series. The first looked at conversion trends across the US in each of the 50 states from a 15-year period from 2001 to 2016. Our 2040 study then took those same trends and projected them out to the year 2040 and what would happen under different kinds of development scenarios. I'm also going to reference a study that I co-authored that pulled the data from that first State of the States study for the 6 New England states that kind of consolidates what's really going on right here in New England. But kind of back to that 15-year period from 2001 to 2016. So what did we find? Unsurprisingly, we found that although in the Northeast and in New England and in New Hampshire, right, we don't have as much farmland as other parts of the country, but we found we're really losing a disproportionate amount. We're losing a higher percentage of the farmland that we do have left. And when we project those same trends out to the year 2040, those same trends held true. Unfortunately, we see a lot of New England lighting up in bright red as being particularly vulnerable to our farmland being converted. And something I want to mention, which I think is pretty cool that our Farms Under Threat study did for the first time, to my knowledge, was it kind of distinguished between different kinds of conversion that was happening across the country. So prior to this study, all we really knew was, something was a farm at one point, and then we looked a few years later and it's no longer a farm, right? And that's sort of what we call on that left end of the spectrum is urban and highly developed type of conversion, what we call UHD. Something was a farm, it's not a farm anymore. The new kind of conversion or threat that we were able to newly identify through very smart GIS researchers that we hired was what we call low density residential development. And I'm sure all of you in New Hampshire are really familiar with this kind of development, right? It's more of that sort of slow burn on the farms, right? Houses kind of being built or development being created kind of on the outskirts of farmland that maybe doesn't all at once turn that farm from being a farm to not a farm, but over time, right, it makes that farm more vulnerable. It impacts the viability, it impacts the sort of farming community and its intactness and kind of threatens it over time. And so we were able to kind of break out these 2 different kinds of conversion. And so when we drill down to New Hampshire, from that, again, 2001 to 2016 period of time, we saw that New Hampshire had almost 12,000 acres of ag land were developed or compromised. And interestingly, about 40% of that was that total farmland loss, right, that UHD. but 60% of it was that low density residential development. And why is that significant? Well, if you look at the box in the left-hand corner, what we found was that land that was in that low density residential development at the start at 2001, by 2016, that land was 6 times more likely to be fully out of agriculture within that 15-year period. So it's essentially this multiplier effect. It's a sort of harbinger of things to come. When we see LDR, we know that land is particularly threatened. And unfortunately, 5 out of the 6 New England states rank in the top 12 in terms of the percentage of ag land projected to be converted. Unfortunately, New Hampshire ranks 7th in the whole country. Under business as usual, that's 8.3% of New Hampshire's farmland projected to be converted. So what does that look like? What does that mean? That is at least 35,600 acres of farmland projected to be lost by 2040, with nearly 60% of that occurring on the state's best agricultural land, equivalent of 400 farms, $16 million in farm output, and 1,200 jobs, with the hardest hit counties being Hillsborough, Rockingham, and Grafton. I also just want to show, because we have some planners on the call, and I noted some of you are actually in Stratford County. I just happened to pick Stratford, but you can actually drill down with our data, and I'll paste links to this in the chat when I'm done speaking. You can actually drill down to the specific county level and actually see these trends. So under business as usual, Stratford County is projected to lose at least 2,800 acres of farmland, and you can kind of see the UHD versus LDR breakdown under these different development scenarios. And again, that multiplier effect comes into play. So for the 2040 study, we found that ag land that was in LDR in 2016 is going to be 3 times more likely to be converted fully out of agriculture by 2040. And unfortunately, New Hampshire only has 432,000 acres of agricultural land. And based on how we choose to develop, based on the decisions we make in the coming years, we could be developing less of that, or we could be developing more of that under kind of what we call the runaway sprawl scenario. And just flagging that New Hampshire has the lowest percentage actually of cropland of all the New England states. About 25% is cropland. And as we know, when we think about where we want to build stuff, we tend to build stuff on places that are already cleared, which tends to be open agricultural crop fields. Right, so we have these different futures. The question really is, which one will we choose? And so obviously for the purposes of this conversation, really advocating for what we at AFT have been calling this, better built cities or communities scenario, right? Where policymakers and land use planners are promoting more of that compact development, right? What Sarah was just talking about, some of those great zoning ordinances and tools. We have those at our disposal. Reducing sprawl, protecting irreplaceable farmland by permanently protecting it, or working to keep it viable through lots of other measures. So there are different futures, and I think we can all work towards that outcome. Just a few more statistics, and then I'll go to some interesting models and tools. But just for that higher level context, despite all the amazing conservation work that we've done in New England in the last 50 years, only 12.5% of all New England agricultural land is actually permanently protected. And actually for New Hampshire, that's about the same percentage. Only 12.3% of all of New Hampshire's agricultural land is permanently protected. So of course that's of concern. That leaves that unprotected ag land potentially really vulnerable to going out of production, being developed in certain ways. So we want to do what we can to prevent that. We also have lots of other compounding threats to farmland loss. I have a lot more slides on that I didn't include. That's for another day. But to sort of summarize, in addition to all this farmland loss, New Hampshire and New England at large has a rapidly aging farmer population. A third of all farmers are over the age of 65. And we know that a lot of those folks don't have succession plans. They don't have a farmer lined up to take over the farm after them, and that's a real concern. We also know the next generation of farmers who are really eager to get onto these farms, right? They really struggle to afford the farmland and the housing. Often these costs are prohibitively expensive for New Hampshire farmers and New England farmers. So there's a lot of things that all of us are doing to really try to address those things, but we have a lot of these compounding threats. I did just want to flag that the farms under threat data I mentioned have been used to inform local planning efforts, and we really encourage that and can get you any of the data that you need. These data have gone into our Massachusetts Farmland Action Plan, where I live, and I noted in the New England Feeding New England for the New Hampshire State Brief, also pulled some of the great data that we have from our study. There we go. Yes, and as I mentioned, policy, I'm not going to dig too much into that, but just highlighting that American Farmland Trust has our own policy platform and policy priorities related to addressing a lot of the challenges that I just mentioned. And the one I pulled out from my colleague, Chessie Gazzillo, who's our New England policy manager, obviously flagging some needs are really increasing the funding for permanent farmland protection through the state programs, ALP, as well as LCHIP, continuing to support the Food Alliance, which I'm doing here today, and exploring farmland access opportunities such as a state Buy Protect Sell program. There we go. All right, so in sum, just really want to flag what I sort of, as I was thinking, as I was pulling together these statistics, what are some imperatives for the New Hampshire conservation community? This is not news to all of you who work on the ground in New Hampshire, but obviously given the limited amount of farmland that remains and the pending threats in terms of what we know we're going to lose, it's vital to conserve as much of the remaining ag land base as possible to protect New Hampshire's food supply and food security. We need to protect farmland, though, in ways that really thoughtfully incorporate farmer housing and affordability, because we know that next generation is really struggling to get on the land, and we know that farmers need housing. And thirdly, we need to sort of stretch our thinking and relationships to collaborate more on projects together and policies that can address both conservation and affordable housing, which is why I was so excited to be invited into this conversation today. So what are some ideas? How do we do that, right? So we have an existing conservation toolbox, right? For all the land trusts and conservation folks on the call, you might be familiar with these tools that exist within the conservation landscape, right? So when we think about protecting land, we can layer on additional tools that can address some of that affordability and access for farmers. So I'm not going to get too into the weeds into these tools. We can talk about them after. But there's a tool called the option to purchase at agricultural value. Some New Hampshire land trusts have been utilizing this tool. It ensures that protected farms stay in the hands of farmers and always sell at a resale value that is at an agricultural value. It's a really powerful tool. You can also include farmer housing requirements or limits on resale value to address, requiring that farmers live in the housing, addressing that affordability piece. And there's other models and tools to borrow from, the community land trust model, where you can do really cool 99-year ground leases on the land. Farmers own the buildings. You can have these cool affordability provisions and equity building mechanisms that can be baked into the lease. There's also buy, protect, sell projects. Land trust can step in, buy a threatened farm, protect it, sell it or lease it to a farmer. And then land trust may just own or acquire farmland that they can say, hey, we can think about, maybe we've never done this before. Maybe we can lease this farm to a farmer, and that farm may also include housing or other infrastructure that would be really critical for a farmer to have access to. So in my last couple minutes, I know I'm a little short on time, but I just want to uplift a couple examples. So I pulled this example, which I was actually involved with 10 years ago now, which is the Wingate Farm in Winchester and Hinsdale, New Hampshire. It was actually the first option to purchase at ag value project in the state of New Hampshire. It was very complicated to pull off the first one, but we got it done. But what this project did was there was a multi-generational farm, again in Winchester and Hinsdale. They were in the midst of trying to transition the farm from the elder generation to the junior generation. They wanted to permanently protect it. The amount that they were going to get from that conservation easement wasn't really sufficient to help kind of buy out that elder generation. And they also really wanted to ensure that the farm would always stay a farm, no matter who they sold it to, if they ever sold it out of the family. And so we were able to use that option to purchase an ag value mechanism, which increased the value of that conservation easement and made the finances work better for the family. And to be able to layer on this additional tool that again addresses that future affordability and buyer. And we also did what we call sort of a whole farm project where we used a deed restriction to tie that house lot to the whole property to make sure that the house and the land would never be separated from each other. So that's kind of an example of using a bunch of different tools within the span of the existing tools within the conservation world that we have access to. I also just want to flag, right, the conservation and housing partnerships are happening more and more around the country and right here in New England. I totally stole this slide from, I think, a Connecticut presentation. I think they borrowed it from LTA. Connecticut and Massachusetts recently have really been talking a lot about this topic. They've had their whole land trust conference really focused on the intersection between conservation and housing and how these things can work better together. And they really can, right? We can, see that we understand that all people need access to open space. Affordable housing is a human right. And again, I think our interests are not so different as they might seem, even though they're often pitted against each other. So the last example I'm going to show, this is an example from Western Massachusetts in the town of East Hampton that was led by the Kestrel Land Trust, which is a regional conservation land trust. I actually spoke on the phone this morning with Mark Walmsley there, who gave me a little bit more context about this project and how it came to be. So essentially, right, they're a conservation land trust. They've never gotten into the affordable housing space before, but they really decided as a land trust that they wanted to sort of step more into this space and really start to serve people that they recognized they hadn't really been serving in their community, around folks who really needed more access to both affordable housing and access to open space. And so they actually sought out an affordable housing project. And what they found was, in the town's open space plan and in the town's housing plan, a lot of these parcels were the same. And so they were able to locate this organization called the Community Builders. They actually owned a property adjacent to this one, so it made it really efficient to say, hey, would you like to create more affordable housing on this lot? And what they were able to leverage with this project was, able to sort of leverage the value of that frontage and the amount of money that sort of the housing world could bring in from other sources, from the pots of funding, state and federal, that can support affordable housing. And they were able to get Community Preservation Act dollars. And then the land trust community was able to focus on raising their money from traditional land conservation sources through the state, through other grants. And so sort of their powers combined, they were really able to make the budget and the financing work to match what the seller really needed to get. And they were each able to kind of bring different things from their own kind of respective industries and their set of relationships. It took some work to build that trust, to develop new kinds of relationships, to do the kind of project that they had never done before. But the end product, and again, this hasn't been completed yet. They're still in sort of the permitting process. But the end product hopefully will be some great new affordable housing. The residents will have access to permanently protected open space, and it will achieve both the town's conservation and affordable housing goals, and really kind of, I think, set the stage for a lot more interesting projects like this to take place. And last thing I'm just going to flag, American Farmland Trust has some really great sort of planning for agriculture resources. I'll also drop these links in the chat. And my dear colleague, Julia Freegood, who's been at AFT for like 35 years, she just wrote and published this incredible book, which talks a lot about planning for agriculture resources and what communities can do, including zoning, conservation, planning. All kinds of really interesting examples and case studies are in this book. So just wanted to uplift that. Thanks, Nicole, for dropping that in the chat. And I'm going to stop talking so we can get into the discussion. Thanks, folks.
All right. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you again, Sarah. That was awesome. A ton of great information. I know that I definitely learned a lot, so thank you for all that. I've been seeing the questions filing in the chat. Let's do a couple questions and then we can, kind of open it up for discussion in our last 15 minutes. Go ahead, Nicole. You want to go with the questions?
Sure. So the ones that I have from the chat, let's see. There was one clarification, Jamie. This one's for you. Doesn't low density residential housing also completely remove the land, i.e. if it becomes a big lawn, it's not growing food. So I think just a sort of a clarification on the high density, low density, density part of your presentation.
Yes, I mean, in some cases, right, like perhaps it could be split up into multiple farms and that might get captured as low density residential. But yeah, generally these are sort of residential houses being built through regular zoning on these outskirts of farmland, right? It takes farmland, it makes it no longer farmland. And so, right, like I said, it's kind of the way I think about it is kind of that like chewing up on the outskirts of farmland where maybe if it's the last farm in town, it can still be viable because it's the last farm, right? We see that in some kind of suburban and urban communities that may not have as much of an impact if that farm is still there. But out in the countryside, right, over time, it makes that farm far more likely to really formally transition out of agriculture and, really no longer be a farm, unfortunately.
Thank you. And there's a question about, yes, if anyone else has questions, please add them to the chat, or raise your hand if you'd like. Patsy, I was asking about if you're also looking at solar farm development as part of this topic.
Yes, yeah, I didn't mention that, but there's also within that Farms Under Threat 2040 study, it does look at sort of threats from traditional solar development within that study. We have a lot of solar experts on our team, and really AFT, I think, is really at the forefront of kind of this middle ground of really promoting more of the agrivoltaic landscape that says, hey, we have these climate goals, we need renewable energy, we don't want to displace farmland. So how can we generate solar in a way that is conducive still to agriculture? So it's really the kind of solar that we promote and promote policies to actually allow farmers and communities to do more of, which is, again, the kind of agriculture where you can graze under these panels, where you can have tractors, do row crops under these panels, which can actually have a lot of really interesting co-benefits for the crops and for the animals. And most importantly, I think for the economic viability of these farms, where it really can be a win-win-win, where the farmer who's probably getting approached by, solar companies to, do more of the ground-mounted, not good solar, promoting more of this more agrivoltaic kind of solar that's going to not impair the landscape permanently and allow more funding and resources to flow into these farmers' pockets so they can stay viable and keep farming into the future.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. I have one question of my own and then I promise I'll get to these raised hands that I'm seeing pop up. My question is, neither of you spoke about housing as a potential revenue source for New Hampshire farms. New Hampshire farms are very small and have really low gross revenue comparison to other farms across the country. And there are some that I know of that have, 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom apartments, basically ADUs on site on the farm. And I'm really curious about the idea of affordable housing and enabling affordable housing developments on farms in small ways that provide both housing opportunities for housing for workers, for tourism, and also provide a more stable revenue source for our very small farms. And could you either of you speak to that a little bit?
I think it's a brilliant idea. What immediately came to mind for me, I believe Emery Farm in Durham has a building that they use as short-term rental on the property. And so it allows that sort of like eco-tourism on a farm and revenue for the farm. So it's a great idea. And there's no reason why anybody wouldn't be able to do that. I didn't mention when we were talking about ADUs, some of the benefits for them is creating revenue for the homeowner. So building an ADU next to your farmhouse, for example, is a great way to sort of increase revenue for that farm.
I imagine that and then I promise I'll stop everyone. And that the limit to that would be the funding to pay for developing or finishing that space. Are there programs that you're aware of that make that more doable for farms financially? No.
No, we've been specifically nothing specific farm related. We have been working with local banks specifically on creating a product that enables homeowners to build an accessory dwelling unit. So that could be utilized here. But there largely has not been great financing for sort of small scale development stuff, unfortunately, including accessory dwelling units.
Great. That's an identified need at least. Molly, I think Molly had her hand raised first. Why don't we start with you and then we'll go to Mark. And then we're going to transition to our questions.
Sorry about that. I had a couple of different mutes to get off. I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with so one of them about the Massachusetts site that you were talking about that had this partnership with agricultural, land-based grants and the traditional kind of housing, revenue sources or ways to fund it through housing development. And I'm just curious if you found, obviously Massachusetts different situation than New Hampshire, but do you see that as a repeatable kind of effort? Was it a very challenging kind of one-off thing that would be difficult to replicate elsewhere? I'm just wondering, what the takeaways of the effort there.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak in too much depth because it's not my project. And I just learned about it this morning in more detail in terms of getting more of the fuller context. But my sense from speaking with Mark Walmsley at Kestrel, who led the project, was, it's complicated, but it seemed doable, right? Like it added complexity, it added, time and more need for discussion and trust building. But and I think a clearer understanding from each of the parties in terms of timelines, right? Like, as we know, conservation, like if you have a state grant, you have to close by the end of the fiscal year. And I think some of those kinds of things needed to be, more clearly communicated, and it does add a lot more complexity. But my sense, at least from speaking with Mark, is that, if you've got the right partners in the room and the right timelines and things add up, that it definitely is doable. And there are, many other examples like this around the country. I will note that Mark also shared with me, I don't know the name of it, but that there's an effort in the Hudson Valley in New York where they have kind of taken a different approach, where they've spent a lot of time intentionally before doing projects, kind of building relationships between conservation organizations and the housing organizations to like create strategic planning processes together, to identify parcels or types of land that would be most suitable, and like really took that time over a period of years to do it that way, right? And versus, what Mark shared is it was more of a kind of, hey, we just want to go do this project, and if we find the right partner, let's make it happen. So I think there's a lot of different ways these can come about, and I think a lot of great precedents that are out there that we can all look to as examples.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to hear about that. If there was resources for the
yeah, I'll track that down for you. Yep.
Yeah, thanks.
I think we want to get to our questions for you all, and then maybe we can let you answer those in the chat while we finish the last couple questions here. Colleen, do you want to move the slide?
Yep.
So what we were hoping from you all, and of course we don't have much time left, but at least give us a start here. We're wondering what is happening in our state. Do you know organizations and people working on smart, thoughtful developments? Do you know good examples of things happening, or great tools and resources that have been helpful in supporting collaborative work? Do you know examples we should hold up or challenges you're facing? We're looking to sort of crowdsource what is going on in New Hampshire as we try to explore how we can support more conversation at the intersection of these two complex issues. So please feel free to add things in the chat or follow up with Colleen or myself after this session, and we'll think about where to go from here. Colleen, did you want to add anything before we call on Mark?
No, I think, I'm going to put my email in the chat, but yeah, let's share things in the chat and we'll just keep answering questions. We have so many good ones.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you. Really encouraged by the discussion I heard in the inclusion of housing into conservation land and for farming. Some of you are aware that we have a very large parcel in Carroll County that we're trying to work with that has prime agricultural land. The county has 800 acres, all of which is not the best of land. That could be a housing incentive there. I was really encouraged by what I heard about in East Hampton. I grew up in that area, Northampton. And I think for those that are on here on conservation commissions and so forth, I want you to start thinking about how can we not exclude all of our land going forward from a housing component. I think the conversation of having some of those lands available for housing, for whether it be a young family to farm, or whether it to be workers, or whether it would be smaller lots and homes, starter homes, that a co-op could then work that land, which is what we're hoping in Carroll County. So if anyone is interested in letting me know on going forward on conservation, the groups, if there's a way to consider a housing component on the outlying areas which aren't considered to be prime to your project, I would like to know. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. And I know I have some friends on here, Ben from CELT and Ellie from KCLT. If they're both doing kind of innovative conservation things of their own, if they wanted to share a little bit with our remaining time, no pressure. But I think, and Sarah's doing an amazing job, and Noah, our friend Noah, is doing an amazing job of answering questions in the chat too. And I'm seeing a lot of good sharing. So I don't know, Ben or Sarah or Ellie, if you want to pop on quick, talk a little bit about what you're doing on the ground.
Yeah, I can chime in quick. My name's Ben Engel. I work for CELT, Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire. We cover a little over 50 towns in Rockingham and Stratford counties. We, I think, are in a position of realizing that we need to start, considering housing as part of our conservation and farmland preservation projects. It's a real priority for the board and our new strategic plan that we just launched into this year. We just closed on 2 OPAV projects over the last couple months, so that was huge. We only have a couple other ones, so we're really ramping up the pace of that. And we've started sort of cautiously talking to some developers, trying to balance like the optics of working with these developers, but the fact is there's going to be development happening either way, whether we're at the table or not. So trying to talk about ways that we can have smarter development and conserve some important land at the same time.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Ben. I definitely encourage people to reach out to CELT if you're a land trust or a conservation organization that's interested in doing things and haven't tackled that area. I think they're a great resource to tap into. Let me see if Ellie's here.
Yes,
Ellie,
I
you are
am
here.
here.
Yeah, chime in a little bit. We have a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll be brief and I'll put my contact info in the chat as well if folks want to get in touch later. But I am involved with a community land trust in the Kearsarge region called Kawasiwadzo Community Land Trust, or KCLT. And we're a pretty new organization. We're focused on sort of the intersection between land and housing, primarily focused on supporting affordable housing, but in ways that doesn't contribute to rural sprawl, maintains rural character of place in our communities here, and really utilizes existing infrastructure and buildings that either have been sitting vacant or redeveloping single family homes into multiple units. So that's kind of our focus. We have a pilot project that we're working on currently. It's a 70-acre piece of property sort of on the edge of the Mink Hills in Warner. It's an old farmhouse, and it was a farm at one point, but we'll need quite a bit of work to get back to that. But our goal is to hopefully make it available for farming at some point in the future. And we're currently raising funds to purchase that property by the end of this year. So yeah, I'll stick our website and my email in the chat, and definitely feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ellie. And I had the privilege of hearing Ellie talk about her work in more detail at the NOFA New Hampshire conference a couple weeks ago. Hence is how I found her and got her here. But if you're interested in kind of the work that she's doing, the approach that she's taking in their organization, definitely reach out to them as well. So I'm kind of leading the horse to water here, trying to get us to think about these kind of different exciting ways that people are having these housing and conservation things intersect. So I think I'm seeing a lot of great stuff in the chat as well. I don't know if Sarah or Jamie, if you have any last words for our crew here. Otherwise, I think we'll probably wrap things up for the day.
Thanks so much for a super amazing, engaging discussion. Even like, I love the presentation going well, but also like the chat just being blowing up with stuff. So thank you all.
Yes.
Same.
Jamie?
I can't wait to read the chat. I couldn't even keep up, but this really makes me think, like, it just seems like New Hampshire's so ripe to continue this conversation, and really eager to see how that manifests, and if we can continue and really kind of dig into the nuts and bolts in the next conversation. I would love that. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you both. You guys are so excellent and shared such a wealth of knowledge. We also appreciate it. I just dropped a bunch of things in the chat. Please take our Network Cafe evaluation. You are already registered since you're here for our April Network Cafe, which is our last one and our most exciting, I'll say, because it is the launch of our strategic plan. So come find out all about that in April. And as I said, the New Hampshire Food and Agriculture Strategic Plan launches later this month. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much for being here and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jamie and Sarah.